Likutei Sichos, Chelik of Ches, volume 28, the Sicha for Gimel Tamuz. That's the third of Tamuz. This Sicha will explain the manner of meseiras nefesh of the previous Rebbe and the reason for it in how he stood up against the mighty Soviet Empire, the communists who wanted to squash Judaism. So just as a brief introduction, so we're better familiar with the Sicha, with the timeline, and what transpired. So the previous Rebbe was arrested in 1927 for his counter-revolutionary activities. That is, he refused to allow Yiddishkeit to die down, and he ran the whole underground network of keeping Yiddishkeit alive. The communists came in the middle of the night on the 15th of Sivan, arrested him, and he was in jail. And they tried to interrogate him and so on and so forth. On the 3rd of Tamuz, he was sent from the prison. He was allowed to leave, but he was sent not home, but he was sent to Kostroma. This was a sentence of exile. He was to be exiled there for 3 years. On the 12th of Tamuz, when he came to register, as the inmates, the prisoners, had to do every day, he was informed that he's going to be set free. However, the official documentations could not be given to him, as it was some kind of holiday, so the office was closed. They told him to come back the next day, and this accounts for why this celebration is the 12th and the 13th of Tamuz. This Sicha will focus on the 3rd of Tamuz, as is the title of the Sicha, and its importance. Interesting that all the details of what transpired, everything that happened, and it's worthwhile to read it, is documented and is factual because it was written by the previous Rebbe himself. He wrote literally a diary, a play-by-play of what occurred to him, what happened from the moment he was arrested until he was released. Another thing to be familiar with is the concept, the idea of meseiras nefesh. Meseiras nefesh means self-sacrifice, right? Giving over your life, your soul. Now, in general, what does this mean? A Jew has the obligation that he has to be ready to be meiser nefesh for Kedushas Hashem, for Kiddush Hashem, for sanctifying Hashem's name. Now, you have to have meseiras nefesh to do what's right, but there are different, so to speak, levels. You have certain mitzvot, like we know the 3 cardinal sins, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah, idolatry, adultery, and homicide, that you cannot, under any circumstances, do it to save your life. You have to allow yourself to get killed. That's absolute meseiras nefesh. There it's an obligation. Or, if something is being done in public, something is being done deliberately to squash Judaism, to break Judaism, to shame Judaism, so to speak, to desecrate God's name, then you have an obligation of meseiras nefesh. Then you have things which the Gemara says, quote, harishus biyadai, meaning you have your own discretion. You're not obligated to be meiser nefesh, but you can be meiser nefesh. In other words, if you have such strong conviction that you cannot see yourself doing that transgression, you're allowed to be meiser nefesh. And then you have things that perhaps you're not allowed to be meiser nefesh on. In other words, they're so relatively insignificant, or they're not that important that you should give up your life for it. And in a certain sense, one can even argue that if you went ahead and you did give up your life for it, then you have committed a sin, not a mitzvah. Why? Because you basically forfeited your life for what? Let's go into the Sicha. So the 3rd of Tamuz is the day when the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, was freed from prison. And many years, it falls out in close proximity of Parshas Chukas, either the week of Parshas Chukas or immediately following Shabbos Chukas. Now, according to the Shalah Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz was a great Kabbalist. The famous saying of the Shalah that he says that all the special festivals, all the Moyadei Hashana, the occasions, the special occasions, are all hinted to and connected to the Parsha that we read in close proximity to that special occasion. And in accordance with this, it would follow that there is an innate connection, there's an inherent connection, or between Parashas Chukas and this celebration of the 3rd of Tamuz, the day of the liberation from prison of the previous Rebbe. There has to be some connection, at least there has to be hinted there. So the Rebbe goes into it and he explains. In the redemption, in the release of the previous Rebbe, there are two phases. You have third of Tamuz, when he was released from prison, from the actual imprisonment in jail. However, it wasn't a full release because he was sent to exile. So you could say it's, quote, Hascholas Hagiula, the beginning of the redemption. Then you have this 12th and 13th of Tamuz, Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tamuz, when there was a total redemption, and perhaps we'll refer to it as Shleimus Hagiula, the completion of it, because here he was already allowed to go back home and be with his family. And therefore, of course, even though the ultimate and the complete redemption was on the 12th and 13th of Tamuz, but still there is a great advantage, or perhaps something special and unique about the 3rd of Tamuz, even over the 12th of Tamuz, even over Yud Beis Tamuz. Now it's true that in actuality we celebrate primarily the big celebration is on the 12th and 13th of Tamuz. And that follows and makes sense, because when do you celebrate? When you have the actual complete full Geula, full redemption. But however, if we focus on the essence of it, if we focus, so to speak, on the depth of it, we'll appreciate that since the beginning of the redemption was on the 3rd of Tammuz, there is a great Maila in the 3rd of Tammuz, even over 12th of Tammuz, which is the completion and the fulfillment, the full fledged Geula as we know it. Why is that? What is so special about the 3rd of Tammuz? Because the actual switch, the actual change from imprisonment to redemption, some form of redemption, some form of freedom, that happened on the Gimel of Tammuz. That happened on the 3rd of Tammuz. Especially if you can consider that in the conditions that existed in those days, the situation that they were under, being in prison directly under their thumb, without any whatsoever freedoms, is certainly more severe than even being sent away to exile, where they had some level of freedom. They had some level of liberty to go about and move about and be themselves. So the actual geula, that switch from total bad to the beginning of good, that happened on the 3rd of Tammuz. Now we know that the beginning of something is inherently inclusive of the entire thing. The start of something already encompasses in it. It has in it. It contains in it, so to speak, the whole story, the whole thing. A good example for it is that we know, and this actually has some halachic ramifications, that if you have the initial letter of a word, it spells out the whole word. You know it as Rashi Tevis. If you have an acronym, or if you have a letter, a letter with abbreviation, that sometimes halachically can actually stand for the entire word. And therefore here, 3rd of Tammuz, which was the beginning, even though it was not full and complete until the 12th and 3rd of Tammuz, definitely has in itself, in it, so to speak, inherently, it already has included in it, contained in it, the entire redemption for the whole thing. Now, what was the entire arrest and liberation? What was it really for? We know. It was for the fact that he had meseiras nefesh, absolute self-sacrifice and selfless dedication to the spreading of Torah and mitzvahs. Such a meseiras nefesh that was without any whatsoever limitation, and even without any whatsoever calculation and rationale. And the Rebbe qualifies that. What do you mean without any rationale? Because the truth is that the situation as it was, the situation that they were in, if one would have made just a basic rational calculation, meaning just a basic rational conclusion of what's going on, it would have come out that in reality, all the activities that the Frierdiker Rebbe was doing, or most of them, had absolutely no realistic chances of success. It was almost like spitting in the air in a sense, going up against this might and against the power and against the successes that they were reaping, the communists, in crushing Judaism. And therefore the question would have been, for what? Why? Why the meseiras nefesh? You have meseiras nefesh for a purpose, for a point. And that's what the Rebbe means when he says that it was a totally unlimited and even irrational, without any cheshbon, without any rational calculation, without any logic, this meseiras nefesh that he had. In fact, the date of Gimel Tamuz itself, being, that we said, being a source of celebration, in and itself is highly reminiscent of the meseiras nefesh of the previous Rebbe, of the quote-unquote, so to speak, irrational meseiras nefesh of the previous Rebbe. Because if you know the whole story, and the whole redemption, so to speak, is connected to this, perhaps you can suggest that the whole thing, the whole idea is connected to, this brings out that it's all about this irrational meseiras nefesh. What is the story behind it? The Frierdiker Rebbe himself relates that really they came to him on Thursday. The third of Tamuz was on a Sunday that year. They came to him on Thursday and they said that he is going to be sent to exile to Kostroma, and that the protocol is that he's allowed to leave the prison, go home for 6 hours to meet with his family, and then be put on a train and off to Kostroma. And the Rebbe asked them, so if I'm going to be leaving Thursday night, when am I going to be arriving in Kostroma? I didn't know what Kostroma is. And they told him, well, it will come out that he will be arriving on Shabbos. That's when he's going to reach his destination. And the Rebbe said to them that under any circumstances he refuses to travel on Shabbos, and he refuses to go. He's not going. And told him, whether you're not going to go. In other words, he says, I'm ready to stay in prison. I'm ready to stay in jail longer. I will not travel on Shabbos. And after much back and forth and all kinds of, I guess you can say, all kinds of attempts and all kinds of requests, and they went up higher to a much higher command, finally he was allowed, he was given, so to speak, the privilege of spending another few days in prison, and he did not leave until Sunday. And that accounts for why Sunday was the day of deliberation. Sunday is the 3rd of Tamuz. In fact, it was so bad that one of the original people who arrested him, and was of course there to kind of see and make sure that the previous Rebbe gets the full brunt, so to speak, of their harshness, of their punishment, he warned the Rebbe and he said, if you're not going to agree to leave now, when we're telling you to leave, and you're going to insist on keeping your Shabbos, then you might end up staying in jail. Going to exile is a better option for you. Like I said earlier, there's somewhat more freedom there, somewhat more liberty. You're going to end up you're staying here. And the Rebbe said, I don't care if it means that I stay in jail forever. I am not traveling on Shabbos. Now, there's a very strong question here. Knowing the circumstances that he was under, and especially considering the fact that initially, chas v'shalom, he was meant to be put to death, as I said in the introduction. There was a terrible, terrible decree. Considering the severeness of the circumstances, it comes out that his refusal to leave jail was something very, very dangerous. He's actually standing up, making a statement against this mighty government. And so to speak, what is he doing? He is publicizing, he is putting his foot down in this jail, in this place of theirs, that's their stronghold, where people are imprisoned. And here he's making the greatest statement about Shabbos. Here is where he's putting his foot down and announcing, I am going to keep Shabbos. It's crazy. Why did he have to do it? Also, especially considering that it's not necessarily for sure that he would have been Mechal Shabbos. Once he was on the train, he could have done all kinds of things, maybe to get off earlier, to stay on the train a little later, or to try to pull some strings and see how to figure out and maneuver things that he shouldn't have to be Mechal Shabbos. So the question is, says the Rebbe, how was he allowed to? How did he allow himself to put himself into this precarious situation where, God forbid, he could have ended up very, very severe punishment? Or Chas v'Sholom, even worse. Here they were trying to, so to speak, be nice to him. Because of the world pressure that they were having, they were trying to be a little more lenient. Different than what they originally intended. What right did the previous Rebbe have to impose himself such danger when we know that you can't just callously have meseiras nefesh? Now, the Rebbe says that the manner of the meseiras nefesh of the previous Rebbe was such that he not only had meseiras nefesh in things that, quote, you have discretion in, but even he had meseiras nefesh in things that other Gedolei Yisrael were opposed to. Like I said in the introduction to the son, I said you're not allowed to have meseiras nefesh. You're basically, in a sense, spiritually at least, committing suicide. You're not supposed to. Now, perhaps we can rationalize it and understand where he was coming from when it comes to his general avodah tzipuris, his communal work that he was doing, all the underground yeshivas and the underground mikvahs and the communities and everything else. We could understand how he went to the extreme. What would be the rationale? Because their whole purpose, the whole objective, was to destroy Yiddishkeit, and Yiddishkeit was facing a determined and unfortunately an absolute extinction. Therefore, he felt that he has to go to the other extreme. He has no choice, and he cannot be mevater on anything. He cannot even allow 1/2 inch. He cannot be lenient on, and he needs to be total meseiras nefesh mode. That maybe we could understand. But going back to his situation with the Shabbos, it would seem that that is out of place. Why? Because this is a private matter. And like we said, it could have even been we. He could have gone, he could have said, okay, I'm going to go, and then later try to maneuver things, and try to pull some strings, and try to work things out that he shouldn't have to be Mechal Shabbos. And who says it's really a Chil Shabbos? He's just be going off a train. He's not really initiating his ride on Shabbos. And so you have somebody else carry it. So there's so many different ways that he could have avoided the actual Chil Shabbos, and still, it's his private thing. It's one man's Chil Shabbos, even if it would be Chil Shabbos. And why and how and why did he have this tremendous meseiras nefesh? And this, not only is it tremendous meseiras nefesh, but God forbid if something would have happened to him, this would have undermined, compromised his entire life's work. This would have undermined and compromised everything that he stood for, because he wouldn't be around, he wouldn't be available to continue on his work. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is as follows. Here, it wasn't a matter, it wasn't a dilemma, it wasn't a discussion of Shabbos, meseiras nefesh, or not meseiras nefesh. Should he go above and beyond? Should he not go? Here it was a matter that involved, and it was dealing with Kiddush Hashem versus Chilul Hashem. The people who arrested the Rebbe, what was the whole objective? To bring down Yiddishkeit. To show that Yiddishkeit and Chas v'Sholom, God, doesn't have the power. They have the power. And therefore, if the Rebbe would have relented, the Rebbe would have said, okay, I'm not opposed to traveling, and even if it's going to travel on Shabbos, even if he would have had intention to figure something out later, and maybe they would have figured something out, but what would have been the message? It would have been widely accepted, widely received, that they won. The Lubavitcher Rebbe agreed to travel on Shabbos. And the people would have heard it, the people who would have found out about this, they wouldn't have known that behind the scenes things can be pulled off and things can be changed and strings can be pulled. To them, it would have been a statement, Chas v'Sholom, that those who oppose Hashem and His Torah won. And therefore, when it comes to a matter of Kiddush Hashem versus Chil Hashem, it doesn't matter at all what it is. If it's a major issue, a minor issue, Shabbos, not Shabbos, you go full out meseiras nefesh. And now we can appreciate the connection to Parshas Chukas. In Parshas Chukas, we have the story with the water. Moshe Rabbeinu, instead of talking to the rock, he hits the rock. And Hashem seems to be handing down such a severe punishment to such a tzaddik like Moshe Rabbeinu. Come on, it doesn't seem fair. Because of this, you're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael? And the fact is that Moshe Rabbeinu did other things the Torah tells us along the way that Hashem was displeased with. And for that, Hashem didn't punish him so severely. The answer lies in the pasuk. Hashem says, Yan lo himantem bi la'agdisheni le'eni kol Yisrael. If you look in chapter 20, verse 12, that this is because that you didn't have enough faith in me to sanctify my name, to make a Kiddush Hashem in front of all the Yidden. So because it's a matter of Kiddush Hashem and it's in public, that's why it was so severe. But example, in Parshas Bahaloischa, when it came to the story of the meat, and Moshe kind of was like doubting and said, Hashem, how are we going to provide so much meat to so many people? Over there, it wasn't private, so to speak. No one knew about it. We know about it because Hashem wrote it into the Torah. But otherwise, you wouldn't have been privy to it. That wasn't so severe. So here we can already see the connection, because the whole story of Gimel Tamuz, the meseiras nefesh of Gimel Tamuz, the whole point of the arrest and liberation is all about Kiddush Hashem. And that's what we find in Parshas Chukas. On a deeper level, the manner in which the Rebbe stood up against the communists, it wasn't only in matters that are directly related or in the direct path of Yiddishkeit, rather in everything. As he writes himself in the diary, that when he got arrested, he came there, he made a resolution in his mind that he will not consider them for anything. It doesn't matter what. If it's with a pencil, with a pen, with a paper, it doesn't matter. The question is, how could he do it? What is this? How is this connected to Kiddush Hashem? In other words, you totally discounting their existence. You going all out meseiras nefesh on everything and anything, whether it's directly connected to Yiddishkeit and your observance of Torah mitzvah, whether it's not, basically everything, meseiras nefesh. The question is, how do we explain it? How is this allowed? How does this promote the idea of Kiddush Hashem? The answer also lies in Parshas Chukas, and that's the connection, in the word Chukas. It says, Zois Chukas HaTorah. The Alter Rebbe explains that the word Chukas doesn't only mean statue, but it also comes from the word Chakika, which means engraved. You see, there are two types of writings. We have a writing of a Sefer Torah, which is ink, which becomes connected to the parchment. It becomes stuck onto the parchment. Yes, they become one entity, but ultimately there are two entities that can separate it. And the fact is that sometimes a letter will fade or peel off. Then you have Chakika. The words, letters that are engraved into a stone, they are one with the stone. They are part and parcel of the stone. And likewise you have in spiritual matters. You have a Yid that's a good Yid, serves Hashem, does everything right, but it's him and the Torah. Him and the mitzvahs. You have him and you have the mitzvahs. It's two separate things. They come together, of course. He's very involved. But they're still two separate things, to the extent that sometimes something can happen that doesn't allow him to do a mitzvah, and he doesn't do the mitzvah. And he's not guilty. It's not his fault. So okay, he's fine. But then you have a Yid that his avodas Hashem is in such a level of chakika that he and the Torah mitzvahs are one thing. You cannot separate the two. And therefore such a Yid is meseiras nefesh on every single thing. Because there's no him and the Torah mitzvahs. Does he have to do this and have to do it? Does he have to be meseiras nefesh? Does he have to not be meseiras nefesh? He and Hashem, he and avodas Hashem is one thing. There's no other way. He can't become separate from himself. He cannot stop being himself. And this is how it was by the Rebbe, says, by the previous Rebbe, says the Rebbe. That all in Yana Torah mitzvahs by him were in a matter of chakika. They were like engraved. They were one with him. And therefore he had meseiras nefesh on each and every single thing, without any rationale, without any calculations. It didn't matter if it made sense or not. There was no other way out. This was who he was. And therefore he had meseiras nefesh for every single thing. And meaning that it doesn't matter what it was triggered by or why, he had full and absolute meseiras nefesh. In other words, it was like automatic. It was b'derech memela. Because his whole existence was Hashem. And if the whole existence was Hashem, anything that wasn't Hashem, he had meseiras nefesh for. This explains the connection between Gimel Tamuz and Parshas Chukas.